It's challenging to be a woman lawyer. It's challenging to be a first generation lawyer. But the guest that we have with us today is that and so much more. She's been a High Court judge for over 15 years. She was the first woman Chief Justice of Telangana High Court. And she's been only one of the handful of women judges who has made it to the top court of the country. In short, in every single way possible, she has shattered all the glass ceilings in the legal industry. Thank you for joining us, Justice Hema Kohli.
Thank you, Nalini.
You've just retired from the Supreme Court. It's going to be a month soon.
Right.
Just to kick off, what has it been like the past month? How different from the life that you had led up till that point, and how have the past month been like?
On my last day of sitting with Honorable the Chief Justice of India on the ceremonial bench, before we entered the courtroom, Chief had walked into our lounge where we meet ordinarily for a cup of tea before we all go to our day's work, and said, "So how was your first day, Hema?" And I remember telling him, in all these years, I never got the time to open the newspaper and look at the headlines. And I did that today over a cup of tea. And that was a starting point of feeling a little different from the normal run-of-the-mill, which is grabbing a few files which got left over the night before, correcting some orders for the day and all that. So it was a little more quieter, more peaceful. I could find time for myself. But otherwise, I would say that in this last 20 days, there have been a lot of friends reaching out. I have more time to be at ease at home. I'm not looking at the watch every half an hour to see what's happening. And a couple of times I actually forgot the date, which felt very good, which has never been the case, because when you're in court, you're signing orders, you're looking at the date all the time and what is the next schedule. So that was a different thing.
Ma'am, coming on to your journey as a judge,
Yes.
from Delhi High Court to Telangana High Court and finally to the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
How was the journey now?
I think it was really gratifying that I never dreamt that I would be able to reach the Supreme Court, or for that matter, maybe be the first woman Chief Justice of a state of Telangana. It was a privilege. When one starts one's journey, one doesn't know which way one's going. And there was no planning in my journey, even when I became a lawyer. And I've said that earlier. It was all fortuitous and it all fell into place. So this was also a great experience. Being a puny judge in a state high court is one among several. Delhi High Court has fortunately had many women judges. Before me, we had a fewer ones. But after me, there were several others who came in, and happily so. And I mean those who came as practicing lawyers, as also those who came from the district judiciary. But when you move further up your journey and start, going up the ladder, so to say, from first 5 to maybe the number 1, before the chief, after the chief is the final senior most judge in the court on the administrative side, your journey takes a different turn. You learn how to handle administrative matters, not just court. You have to handle people. You have to handle staff. You have to handle committees. Those are experiences that were put to good use when you become a Chief Justice of the State High Court.
Was it tougher being a Chief Justice than
I didn't feel the difference, to be honest. By then, I think one had learnt the ropes. It was only going to a different state. People have this impression that Telangana would only be Telugu-speaking state, which must be dispelled. Not for a moment did I or my family feel the discomfiture, for the simple reason that they speak Urdu, they speak Hindi, they speak English and Telugu. And it's not as if you're left high and dry and there's a communication gap, not at all. And in any case, in the High Court, the speaking language remains English. So it's just that maybe when the documents come across you, if it's a FIR, if it's a revenue record, and there are translations required, it's different. But beyond that, I don't think it was different. It was a much smaller court compared to where I came from, in the sense the strength was less. By where we started when I was there, we were 14. Today, there's a strength of almost 38 or 39, touching 40. The total strength is about 42 there. So I didn't feel the difference. I thought it was, and we were very cohesive. Incidentally, that was COVID time, so we were not meeting ever so often. Mostly things were being done virtually. In that phase of 21 January to August 21, we were going through the second phase. We had entered into, and that was critical for the entire country. So we're all working virtually.
But there were a lot of differences also. I mean, in
Yeah.
the Delhi High Court, which is considered one of the most premier
Yes.
high courts in the country,
Right.
to go to a much smaller, newer Telangana High Court, where you were, I think, except for one, the only female judge.
No, I had another colleague who
Yeah,
had come
except for
from
one, exactly.
UP, except her. Well, the gentlemen, perhaps initially, they never shared it with me, by the way. When I came in, they may have trepidations that they had a woman Chief Justice, but it never showed it. So the only thing I did to break the ice was that when I came there, I met all my brothers with their spouses and any family member. I had invited them over for a cup of tea by turns, just to understand how that, what are the nuances of the court, what is the expectation, and what is the demand on a Chief Justice. And they were very cooperative, and each one gave their respective inputs. That came of good use to me. I was able to keep in mind factors which they thought needed to be addressed. And in that short period of 8 months, we're able to do a lot with the support of my colleagues, including appointing judges, including increasing the strength of judges, including disposals, and so on and so forth. So really, though I may have come from a larger court in the sense of we have a lot of more matters than just land, revenue, family court and criminal, because of a lot of IPR, a lot of commercial litigation. But then let's not forget that Telangana, particularly Hyderabad, is the IT city of the country, and they have a lot of international firms there. So their commercial work was picking up at that time. It'll constantly pick up and go higher. So they'll also be perhaps handling all of this. It's a matter of time that the volumes will increase.
Ma'am, this 75 years of Supreme Court already,
Yeah.
just 11 women judges so far. What do you think is the basic problem? Where is the problem?
I would say, Kanu, that for picking up a judge, a woman judge, there has to be a pool of women, a big enough pool to find the right persons and to select them for being recommended by the collegium. In our days, there were lesser women. So lesser the women, smaller the pool. It's proportionate. But the moment the pool expands, there'll be more choices, more women to pick up from. How many पहले कहते थे कि women lawyers ही बन जाएं तो बहुत भारी बात है. उसके बाद women senior advocates बनने लगी. और कितनी बनी? और बहुत बनी. कई कोर्ट्स में तो बहुत बनी. हमारी दिल्ली हाई कोर्ट में बहुत बनी. अब तेलंगाना में भी women senior advocates हैं. हर leading state high court में है. So what is happening is, if that pool expands, automatically the choices increase. So it's proportionate to the number of women who enter the stream, who continue in their career, make a mark for themselves, and are visible to the collegium for being picked up.
But
That's
what is
how
it? What are the kind of challenges that a woman in the legal profession has to face?
And you being the first generation lawyer in your family.
Yes, several challenges. Challenges start at the grassroots level, starting with firstly finding a placement for yourself in the legal profession. A litigation lawyer can't work suddenly out of the blues without some kind of matters. For those matters, you have a learning experience. Who on the street will walk up to you and give you a brief without knowing you? So you have to make a mark for yourself some way. How do you make a mark? You have to join somebody to learn. Those learning experiences come from chambers of seniors. You have to be able to find somebody appropriate, willing to take you on a raw hand. I mean, frankly, what would a raw hand do except learn? You're not being very useful to your senior initially till you are able to make that place for yourself. So first challenge is to find a good office, a senior who's willing to take you on, who's willing to teach you. And then comes the next challenge of being able to find briefs on your own when you move out of a senior's chamber and that comfort level, to be able to sustain you in the profession. And I don't just mean financially, sustain you as you should be visible. So what was ordinarily a person to look for panels of public sector undertakings, of authorities, of departments where there is more work and a greater learning experience. You do that even when you join a senior who has more work, a larger volume of work where one would get an entry at some point or the other. A small entry, which you would probably value and be able to make a mark for yourself. That's where the journey starts. So that challenge is the first challenge a woman faces. The second is that you can't make a name for yourself unless you get a matter sufficiently important for you to be noticed For that, also the waiting is long. The gestation period, as it is in the legal profession, is long. For a woman, it is longer. In that journey, she also has to break it many times because she gets married. She has to break it because she has to procreate. She has to find the time then for not only with her profession, but her family, her children, her in-laws, her husband, all of that. So when it is 7 years ordinarily on getting married, times they have to take a break from their careers and go back. So it's a setback. Their contemporary batchmates would have moved on. Their journey starts from, again, the basic and go back again, pick up the threads. It's not easy.
And there are additional challenges, especially for women, like we are seeing in the aftermath of what happened in the Kolkata case.
Right.
Where the doctors have now come out on the streets demanding better conditions, better working conditions.
Yes.
So equally, there are challenges such as that for women in the legal space also.
Right.
So my question to you would be that everything that the courts have done, whether it be Vishaka guidelines, whatever the legislature has done, whether it be implementation of the POSH Act, do you think those have sufficiently tackled the challenges that women face? And B, if they've not, then what has been the fallout of these decisions on women in the law industry?
So, we all talk of Vishaka because that was a landmark judgment. There was no statute at that point in time. Incidentally, POSH has completed 10 years in the year 2023 as an act. Unfortunately, not many of the persons who should know about it, including the victim, the aggressor, and most of all, the employer, they don't know as much as they ought to know about it. So what is the consequence? The consequence is anybody who's a victim, and I'm now talking of within the legal profession, firstly, they don't know where to go. Secondly, we need as an institution to make ourselves more visible, that there are internal committees, that there are gender sensitization committees, that there should be workshops where they should come forth and know how to handle themselves. It's a matter of chance that I was heading the internal complaints committee in the High Court, as also the gender sensitization committee of Supreme Court. In the Supreme Court, there were a lot of workshops organized with the idea of letting women, not just women, know, letting every sphere, every department know. What would that be? That could be the contractual workers who come to the courts in and out. They could be regular employees. There would be lawyers. There would be the security staff. Each one has an interface with a woman at some stage or the other. After all, when we have security and the women walk in, breeze in through the entrance. And they do have those cards for their identity. But there is still an entrance that they have to go through. Men should know how to handle their pat down. There should be women security officers posted there. There are niches and corners we found which were so dark in the evening that women would be reluctant to cross over from that to over the road to go to the parking. Now, these are things one has to be very hands-on to discover. So it's important for women to be conscious of the fact that there is a forum where they can go. And for women lawyers, that forum is the Bar Council. It is not the Supreme Court or the High Court designated committee. Some of them don't even know that. That is something which we need to disseminate. One of the fallouts of the POSH Act in the negative sense, if you will call it negative, is that when women have come out and loud and clear and stopped brushing things under the carpet when they face sexual harassment, some of these seniors and some of the advocates and chambers have created an unwritten rule that they'd rather not get into a mess and they'd rather not take a woman in turn. That has been a negative impact in that sense because it's a setback for those young women who would like to be in particular chambers. They aspire to work there, but there is that reluctance or resistance, maybe in some places, because of this.
Are they scared to hire women?
They are wary, shall I say, not scared. They'll be wary. Well, as you know that there is misuse of any enactment. There has been misuse of the Dowry Act. There has been a misuse of several statutes which have been highlighted in different studies and researches. POSH is still a 10-year-old act. It's not all that old. It's not been used as much as perhaps it ought to. But there are always that some little element who misuses it. And the net effect is the disability that the entire community faces.
Right.
that is what happens also.
But POSH is still not applicable in the Indian Army. They have their own things, and the harassment complaints that we are seeing
Yes.
from inside Army. Do you think that time has come that Indian Army should also adopt?
Perhaps the seniors there need to internalize it, because their systems are very much in place. They have a pretty regimented system. Even otherwise on the criminal side also, it's a summary court-martial. Their systems are different. Their requirements are different. In a POSH Act, if there's a complaint, then the parties have to keep coming in and giving their affidavits, and there is a whole process. When it is the army, then most of them keep moving from place to place. And the transfers are so often that any inquiry would not be completed unless they're called back to the place where the origin took place. Maybe that is one of the reasons why they want a quicker closure to such a matter and a more summary procedure vis-a-vis a regular POSH complaint.
Coming back to lack of diversity within the higher judiciary, do you think that this lack of diversity impacts the kind of judgments that are pronounced? More specifically, this is a two-part question. A, what kind of matters are mostly assigned to women judges? Is there an idea in the mind of the judges that only certain kind of matters can be decided? And B, when a woman judge is not part of a bench that is deciding on a crucial aspect that is likely to impact women on a larger scale, do you think that negatively impacts what the decision might be?
Okay. Firstly, the aspect of whether women judges are assigned specific matters only to deal with. When we talk of the district court, frankly, they have no choice because it's rotational. So every assignment has a fixed timeline, maybe 3 years in a criminal jurisdiction, 3 years in a civil, 3 years in a family court, so on and so forth. Ordinarily, family courts are populated more by women judges because of the nature of jurisdiction, but not necessarily. And the POXO Act also, again, there are many times more women for the same reason. But when it comes to the higher judiciary, our jurisdictions ordinarily, some courts 3 months, other courts 6 months, so on and so forth. Not less than 3 because then the continuity completely breaks. I do find that in some courts there is this tendency only to assign such like matters of family court, of juveniles or of children, only to women. But I want to say that many times men are more empathetic than a woman judge could be. They can look at some of the nuances which may not occur to a woman, and likewise for a woman. What she carries on the dais is her experience as a woman, as a mother, as a sister, as a wife, and that's true for a man too, as a husband, as a father, as a son, as a sibling. So they carry their own unique experiences onto the bench. What is the opportunity they get to make that mark on a matter of consequence? Depends on the opportunities, frankly. And men have contributed phenomenally to woman-centric issues in many of the judgments. If you go back and check, you will find that there has been a very sensitive approach to some of these issues, which men have adopted. So I would say everybody should get that opportunity, and that's how a well-rounded jurisdiction will emerge on and has emerged on issues relating to women.
But has there been any bias that you have faced
your
tenure as a...
Maybe I would have been happier if I, as a division bench, because all appeals from family courts ordinarily go to a division bench in the High Court. That's how the statute has contemplated it. So I've found many times, for a large period, family court appeals came in huge numbers because that was part of my jurisdiction. It's a very taxing jurisdiction. It takes a lot of toll on you emotionally also, because you're dealing with people. You're not dealing with disputes as in money matters or land or property. You're dealing with people, real-time people where there are lives at stake, children at stake, the whole family at stake. It is taxing. And I found that there was a whole spell where I was invariably, and many times that jurisdiction had come my way. And I think we sat till 7 p.m., many times till 9 p.m. in the process because you wanted to resolve. Your first effort is to try and resolve the dispute in a family court. You're not there to sit and write judgments on that. Not at all. You're not creating jurisdiction for that. You're doing it at best to do a resolution. So it is taxing. It takes a lot of toll on you. Many of my male colleagues also felt that. But I found that when there is a man and a woman both on a dais and a division bench, it balances it better.
Ma'am, how crucial is the role of mediation, especially in the family disputes when it comes to... Now we have a huge mediation centers across.
Yes.
So what do you think?
It is very important. It is imperative. When we started in the Family Courts Act, I became a chairperson of the Family Court in Delhi somewhere in 2009 and remained so till I demitted office and moved on to become a Chief Justice to Telangana. In that whole decade, Delhi was going through the process of creating family courts. Those family court jurisdictions have to mandatorily have conciliators attached to each family court judge. So we made sure there were not just two conciliators, there was a principal conciliator and two attached to them. Every matter had to go through them before it went back to the family court. That's how important mediation is. That kind of mediation, what we call madhyasthata in Hindi, has to be done in a family court matter before it is taken to the family court judge for deciding on merits. That's a duty. The Act contemplates it, that every matter must be first resolved, if not possible, then sent to regular arguments on merits.
Ma'am, your image in the judiciary is of a tough judge. How do you respond to that?
Well, yes, I think that's what the image is a correct position. I am a strict judge in court, but I don't see anything wrong with being a strict judge. It is important, firstly, when you're a woman, to be taken seriously, whether you're a lawyer or you're a professional or you're a judge. When you carry that impression and that it's a no-nonsense court, then everybody else should know that it's a no-nonsense court. We are here to do work and we are here to do it to our best of our ability. So if I think that I'm a tough judge, the whole purpose was to be able to get people to come and argue and take orders wherever they were supposed to be done. I don't think I ever appreciated adjournments. As a rule, I would say that one Passover is good enough, be it a senior or a junior. No distinction between a senior and a junior was my rule. In fact, I think that I was more generous with juniors because they needed that space. Very importantly, for them to be able to blossom. We needed that space when we were youngsters. Why wouldn't juniors need that space when they get those spaces? They're able to make a mark for themselves. If it's a senior, my rule was that if senior is missing, the junior is free to argue. But I find that there is no merit. I would rather not dismiss it and leave it on the shoulder of the junior because the client the senior is answerable to a client. Get the senior over, hear the matter. But if it's a fit case for notice, why would I not give the privilege to that junior to carry that I was able to convince the court and get a stay or whatever?
We've seen in your court that there is no distinction between a junior lawyer or a senior
I tried.
lawyer, as much as a judge can. But there are a lot of judges who rely a lot on face value of the lawyer who is appearing before them. In addition to the fact that Supreme Court over the course of the past few years seems to have become the hegemony of a few lawyers who are appearing in almost every case. Do you think that there is not equal opportunity being granted to members of the bar because judges rely so much on face value of the lawyers?
Nalini, it's like this. It works in two ways. One, the clients sometimes don't have the confidence in their advocate on record or a advocate arguing counsel and feel that they need a senior because the stakes are too high. They can't risk it. The other aspect is, yes, of course, in every court there are seniors who are well-known, who are renowned, who have made a mark for themselves, particularly in constitutional matters. But then it is for the judge to make sure that one is not selective about giving special accommodation to a senior merely because there's a face value attached to him or her. The idea is that if the matter is good on merits and an arguing counsel is as competent to assist you, for example, if I wouldn't give more than one Passover, and invariably seniors are busy running all over. Now we have virtual, luckily. They can even log in virtually. They don't have to be physically running all over, except switching screens. You can encourage the arguing counsel to argue it too. And if there is still a need for a senior to make a point, give that space. But at least then that arguing counsel gains the confidence and the client gains the confidence in the arguing counsel that maybe if I had not engaged a senior, I have got the same result or a better result. Because who's briefing the senior? Ultimately, the arguing counsel. At the end of the day, the senior will always give her special input to a matter because of the vast experience they carry. But the arguing counsel, nobody knows the case better than the arguing counsel. Not the judge, not the senior advocate, this is the arguing counsel. So that confidence that one has to build into the bar to make sure that the arguing counsels come up to the next level and shape up as good seniors lies on us also, as much as judges, as it would lie on clients encouraging their own arguing counsels to argue the matter.
Ma'am, what's your opinion on increasing the retirement age for judges?
Look, there are countries, we know many of them, where now the minimum age of retirement is 70. The age profile of our population has also changed to a large extent. Now, they say 80 is young. At one time, 80 was supposed to be, that's it. The moment you touch 60, you're done with. The kind of experience that one gathers over the years as a judge and it can be put to use by serving the judiciary and by default the public increases and enhances. So one is young, fit and fine. Young in the sense, young in mind, fit and fine. Maybe a call can be, the legislature can consider enhancing the age from whatever it is today with the High Court 62 and the Supreme Court 65 to something more, because end of the day, those of us who demit office, most of us go into arbitrations and are doing the same kind of a work in a different environment. The only difference is you're being paid well for it, which is not the case when you are doing a service. And I'm not complaining about it because one goes into this as a service. It is not to earn money that you become a judge. One has a flourishing practice, most of us, when we were lawyers and selected to become judges. You knew what you were going in for, so you can't complain that you've done a big sacrifice. I would not say that. I did it because I wanted to do it. And that sacrifice was part of the system that I had to. But yes, if they can earn beautifully outside of the system on demitting office, if it was an extension of it, they'd be serving the institution.
Coming to this issue that you're talking about, judges being appointed in the higher judiciary, do you think, time and again, we've seen the Supreme Court has had to remind the central government to clear the names. Several files the central government is sitting on for years. Till date, those judges are not being appointed. In a system where seniority means everything, how well do you think this system of the collegium appointing judges is working?
You see, the point would be, what is the alternative? Let's look at it from both angles. That how well is it working? Well, it's every system has its positives and negatives. And so would this. But is there a better system in place? If there's a better system, maybe one can migrate to it. But till it is functioning as it is functioning, and one must dispel the impression that the government has no role to play in the appointments, for the simple reason that the IB clearances and so many other layers of clearances come up from them. The input goes to the collegium only thereafter. So the recommendee goes through that process without any interface with the executive. Once those clearances come, then only is the name considered in all seriousness, and whatever material comes in is also taken into consideration by the collegium regarding each candidate. So the system's working as best as it can. But talking of delays in appointment, I'd said it earlier and I'll say that again, that the dialogue must continue, must be constant and must continue on both the back end and the front ends. Otherwise, there would be probably a breakdown, which is not okay for the system. That breakdown shouldn't happen. If there's a constant dialogue, then the answers will keep emerging from the dialogue. But if one just keeps quiet about it and let it be, perhaps then it takes that much longer. The candidate loses interest. There have been cases where the candidates selected have said, look, we are not interested in waiting any longer. Our careers are on hold. And why do they say that? You see, they're in a very tight catch-22 situation. Their names have gone are recommended. Their clients know their names are recommended. The new ones are not going to come and knock at their door because they're not sure that if that counsel will be available to them by the time their matter ripens. So their careers also get impacted in the process, and they don't know what the future holds for them. So all in all, it is important for that dialogue to continue. It has to be a constant effort on both sides to break the barriers and to overcome whatever other difficulties and be vocal about it to each other.
The criticism of the collegium system is that it's very opaque. I mean, it's trying to become more transparent, but there is still certain level of opacity that's involved. And I understand the reason behind it because it's regarding judges, like you said, when the center gives security checks, there might be some red flags that might crop
That's
up
right.
regarding appointment of certain judges. When this happens, and the judge is already a sitting judge of the High Court, why is it that he's allowed to continue as a judge of the High Court, but not seen as fit for appointment to the top court? Like, is there a difference in the kind of judges that make it to the top court versus judges that just stay at the High Court level? Like, what is it that requires?
Look, earlier the norm was that invariably the pool would largely be from the Chief Justices of the State High Court
Correct.
for selection to the Supreme Court. That has slowly been diluted for various reasons. When it comes to women, for the simple reason that there are lesser women Chief Justices, and if there are only one or two, then how many will make it to the Supreme Court? So one has to go down the level. But how many steps down would you go is another question, because let's be honest, as you said, being selected at the right time and making it to the right time is important. So somebody who's picked from way down would create a heartburn for those who's above that particular candidate. But then merit would also have to find some place in it. And it is ordinarily going down in the sense of looking for merit and going down. So somebody may not have blossomed into, and I'm not saying ideal. Nobody is an ideal judge. Nobody can be an ideal judge. We all have our foibles and fallacies. I mean, I would be the first one to admit it. Nobody is perfect. So to come to Supreme Court doesn't mean you're the perfect judge. Not at all. You're good amongst those where in the pool which was at that time in contemplation before the collegium. Let's put it like that. Or your merit was counted, and there were many other nuances. Let's also not forget that there is a representation, not in strictly speaking, but in the sense of every state must find its place under the sun in the Supreme Court too. One can't just ignore the state completely, one state, because maybe the top three are not ideal candidates for appointment. So there are so many things that a collegium has to consider. And in the course of consideration, the ruling out takes place. So you go into that level, you rule out candidates, you shortlist them, and there's not one mind. There are 5 minds or 3 minds when it comes to selection, 5, and though all of them have to be on the same page. So there is sometimes friction too within the collegium, which may not be appropriately to be brought out in the open. It's not the proper thing to do. It should remain within the collegium. And then they have to settle down to a candidate which is acceptable to all of them within that shortlisted pool. So the process is there, but it's not made so open, and it can't be so transparent for certain reasons. As I would say, for somebody who's a selected candidate for a High Court appointment, she would not know what were the negatives about her.
Correct.
If you put it in public domain, he or she would really have a tough task to deal with it. They won't go to the press or the media to say that this is not how it was and this is my version. They can't. Similarly, no judge who's of the High Court would say that, okay, I was ruled out for this reason, not on. It can't be. Absolutely not. That would really create a stigma on the person, and the rest of the career would be very difficult to live by. After all, the judge is not selected doesn't mean he doesn't remain a judge. But how many judges would go to that court? There are 34 vacancies.
Yeah.
It's not possible for everybody to go there. Aspire, yes, and that's a legitimate right. But how many would make it would depend on so many things.
I'm coming to a vacancy that
Yes.
your retirement has created. Are
Right.
you hoping a woman judge will
Well, I was
replace
vocal
you?
enough to say that, and to no less than the Chief Justice of India. Though on a casual basis, it's not my place to insist on it, but I certainly feel that it would be a great service to the Supreme Court if there was a woman who was selected, and if not maybe half a dozen women, at least the number of 3 or 4 that we reached once should be maintained. We were 4 when Justice Indira Banerjee and my other 2 colleagues and I took over. We were happily so. And I think that's the least that should be done.
I don't know if you know this.
Yes.
But there was this collage of pictures of the 3 of you taking oath on the same day, and that had gone viral on social media.
Yeah, I did, because friends posted it, and I was pleasantly surprised because we had the Chief Justice then, Justice Ramana, in that frame. And I think all of us were grateful that that collegium headed by Justice Ramana thought that it was fit to have 3 women selected contemporaneously instead of that one symbolic woman, to say, okay, there is a woman in the Supreme Court. That is not the done thing. Let's not forget we are 48.5% population amongst the country, in our country, so which is nearly 50%. So more the women, the more the inclusion, I think the better the results.
What for you as a judge was the judicial philosophy that has guided you during your time as a High Court judge and a Supreme Court judge?
I think for a judge, ideally, the first and the foremost thing must be to keep your heart in the right place. It's not all about statutes and law. You're dealing with people. You're dealing many times with people. Of course, commercial disputes are a different nuance. But you're dealing with people, you're dealing with lives, you're dealing with those who are not before you. A litigant with his whole family behind him because he thinks he says his retirement dues haven't come. A litigant who says that I'm a victim of a motor accident claim case, my whole family suffered because I'm out of a job. So it's not that person alone. It's the persons who are supporting him, who are his support system, who are equally important. So to my mind, it is important that your heart is in the right place. That is one part of the philosophy which is very important. The second part is to be aware of the ground realities and not cut yourself away and live in an ivory tower. It is very important to realize how people are living their lives, what kind of a background do they come from in that litigation. I do remember there was a water woman who would serve water for 4 hours in an office in a remote part of a rural office and the criteria was that for appointment, because there was none other, that if it's a widow of the same area and is deserving, she should be appointed or given an appointment because the government had made a scheme of that sort. So there were these 2 widows with 3 children each, and the contest was who had come in earlier. But look at what was happening to the other one who was left out because she had no role to play because the other lady came from the neighboring village and she was from that village. The litigation was so heart-rendering because they were just helpless. And imagine a water woman coming right up to the Supreme Court to seek justice. How much of courage it must have taken her to tread that path. And she succeeded ultimately. Why? Because we, in our wisdom, and that's why I say the heart should be in the right place. As a bench, my brother judge and I thought that it is only fair that we invoke our extraordinary powers and tell the state to carve out that little space to give them both an appointment instead of throwing one out and bringing her on the road because they were both widows, both had small children to bring up. Those things, fortunately, the Supreme Court has the power to do, which the High Court doesn't. But that's what justice is all about.
Ma'am, all your judgments talk about public interest at large. Last judgment we saw is of Patanjali advertisement case. You really, grilled Baba Ramdev in the open court, and people were like, you're the toughest judge to crack. Even Baba Ramdev, you have to tell him that, you are a yoga expert. Do that. Don't get into the domain. What do you think, has actually been the court's motive, the bigger motive of grilling the Patanjali for the wrongdoings and for the public at large?
And
See
also exercise
yes,
of contempt in general.
I was just going to say that. This whole thing played out in contempt jurisdiction. Contempt jurisdiction is a very powerful weapon that the courts have. They don't use it as often because they know that it is so powerful and it must be used sparingly. But then again, that is a jurisdiction vested in the courts with the purpose of ensuring compliances of orders passed. One is the compliances and others are the undertakings that parties give to the court on their own. When an undertaking is given by a party, then also there are compliances to be made. Assuming a person comes up and says, I assure you, court, I will not go this way, I will not do this. And we find that that person is doing exactly that. That is also a violation and a breach of an undertaking. The other is, we pass an order saying, you are not to do X, Y, Z. Now that's an injunction on a party. And if that is violated, that is again a breach of an order passed by the court. To ensure that the majesty of the court is maintained, that the public must understand that if there is an order of the court, law must prevail and rule of law demands that an order of the court must be obeyed to the hilt. There is no negotiation on an order of the court. It is important that the contempt jurisdiction come into play. When one finds violations, then we have the power not just that a party has to tell us and come and file an application saying, look, this has happened. A party need not necessarily come. We can also initiate it ourselves, and we have what we call suo motu jurisdiction. You know, you've been in the legal field. And suo motus is also taken as seriously because the court feels there's a gross violation. This was one of those cases where undertakings were given by the counsel of the parties to the court, and that they were violated with impunity. That is why it panned out in the manner it did. Not only were they violated, even after it was pointed out by the opposite side that there was violation, it was not undone. When it is not undone, then that is a more serious matter. And if that is not undone, the first thing one does is to call the contemner in, which we call the proposed contemner, because we have not made up our minds. That proposed contemner could be anybody. It could be a man or woman of prestige or of the highest position, or somebody who could be just an ordinary citizen leading his ordinary life, but has come in an interface with the court in some matter. So it's not the personality. It may have engaged the public at large because that's a known figure. Contempt jurisdictions are exercised in routine matters also. If there are violations in a landlord-tenant dispute, I had mentioned once, a tenant violates an undertaking that he will vacate the property. If he forgets to vacate it, or he deliberately can't forget, obviously there is an order. But he deliberately doesn't, or plays around, or maybe files an extension application thinking now that I've filed it, 6 months can even be 1 year. You must be able to convey as a court that there is a law that must be obeyed. And the whole purpose of contempt jurisdiction lies in that obedience to the orders of the court. Nothing to do with the judge.
But there was so much social media chatter regarding this case. And even in general, with
Yes.
regard to the functioning of the Supreme Court, there is a lot of social media commentary that goes on. Do you think, did you personally ever feel pressured by what's being reported in the media, what's being carried in the social media?
Just to add to this, do you think live streaming should be there or should be curtailed down to only few?
As of now, in the Supreme Court, live streaming is done for those matters which are important, significant, where there is public has a interest and a role and must be made aware of it. For example, constitution benches and some other select matters. As I understand, this West Bengal matter is also being live streamed. There are other occasions when matters are live streamed. Live streaming has its advantages. Nobody has to come up to the court to know what's happening. They can just log in. That's a big thing in a country as vast as ours. And to that extent, video conferencing facilities have worked beautifully. I think that we've had young lawyers from remote states who have logged in and argued their matters themselves, which they would never have done in ordinary course had they to physically come to the court. Perhaps their clients couldn't have afforded it. So even if they didn't afford it, they got an opportunity and a window to go to the Supreme Court. That was one. The second part of being the social media, I think I'm not on social media. I was never one as a judge on social media, except your personal messages with friends. One ordinarily keeps away from it. But, and that's true for most of the judges who are
But you must be privy to what is
But
going
yes, I was going to say that. You can't be living in a fortress. You're living in a world which is a real world. You have people around you. They talk about it. The point is how much of determination you have to remain in balance, how much of strength comes from within, how seriously you believe in the way you are taking your matter, then it shouldn't bother you at all. You're not here to earn brownie points from the social media. You're here when you're sitting on that post to do justice in the manner you think is the correct manner of doing it. That should be your leading guiding factor. That's your guiding light. Am I doing it as I should within the four corners of law? Then whatever social media may say shouldn't be influencing the judge at all. But yes, the consequence of many of these live streamings and sometimes even when people log in is that some simple questions which are posed by a judge in the course of understanding an issue that is brought before him or her are misunderstood or given a different twist, and many times out of context. It becomes then difficult for the judge to be free and open enough to ask questions. The idea of asking questions is to elicit responses, to clarify thoughts, to throw out any cobweb or any misunderstanding of a point that a party would have made. But if everything is going to be criticized, then the judge can also get wary because he or she may think that, okay, I'm going to be lampooned because I've asked a question. That's not the purpose. The purpose is to get and understand the nuances of a matter. That must be appreciated and reported in the right context.
There's something odd I noticed about the live streaming of the Supreme Court.
Yes.
First, constitution bench matters were being live streamed. From the public interest matters, and all the constitution benches were headed by the CJ.
Right.
The public interest matters, all the matters that are being taken by the Chief's bench are being live streamed. So are the other Supreme Court judges not as keen on live streaming that, or is that something that is in works, something that will happen at a later
first
stage?
thing would be I'll just correct you on that. Not all constitution benches were headed by the Chief Justice. If you will recollect, in the year 22, they were Chief, J1, J2, J3, J5. All of them were handling constitution benches. If you remember, Justice Indira Banerjee, before she demitted office, had headed one. Justice Abdul Nazir had.
Right.
And many of them had headed it
Yes.
and delivered judgments.
No, I was talking about the current Chief Justice.
You're talking the current one.
Yeah.
Yes, in this tenure, the constitution benches have been largely in that constituted in that manner. But not that there was any discussion or debate about it at all within the system to ask a judge, or was it a choice of the judge? I don't think I'm privy to that.
No, it wasn't about
it's
the
not
constitution
been asked.
of
No, you're
benches.
asking of live streaming.
That's
That's what I'm saying. It's not as if it is by choice or anybody's been asked or somebody has declined. It's not been like that.
Okay.
This Karnataka High Court controversy, the judge was seen, talking to a woman lawyer in a bad manner. The Supreme Court has taken a suo motu.
Right.
Had the social media not in place, we all would have not known about it. So, what do you
Yes.
think? Is it good live streaming at High Court level so that at least public at large should know?
Where on the other hand, you also have Kapil Sibal coming to court
Yes.
and saying that his reputation that he's built over 50 years
West Bengal.
is being destroyed because of this very same live streaming.
So, nothing can be without a consequence. Live streaming is also one of those phenomena. Everything has a plus and a minus. One has to learn and live with it, and accept some things, because you are not in control. Once you're sitting in a seat like that, and once you're a lawyer, you're in a public domain like that, one has to accept it as part of the territory. Really, there is no choice. There are pluses of the live streaming. I just said, live streaming, and for that matter, virtual hearing. Even if it was not being live streamed, if there was a virtual hearing, somebody could have done the same. Right? So it's not as if it is necessary a matter needs to be live streamed for something negative to come out. Sometimes virtual hearings, there are hundreds of people who have logged into matters in virtual hearings because the link is there. Anybody can log in. And if something is happening which is unacceptable, I should think the bar should be the first one to red flag it, because the bar is there all the time. If, let us say, somebody is denigrating a woman lawyer, whether a opposite side counsel, and if it is an opposite side counsel, it is the duty of the judge to intervene and make sure that that woman doesn't face that kind of a issue because she's a woman lawyer. That's very important, or maybe coming down on a woman or treating a woman lawyer lightly or casually. Certainly it's the duty of a judge to make sure that that doesn't happen in his or her court. That I would say would lie with me. But if it is happening, a judge vis-a-vis a litigant or a lawyer, then what is the bar doing? The bar has to be equally strong and come up and maybe protest or make a point of saying and making enough noise for the concerned judge to step back and understand that Lakshman Rekha has been crossed. So there's a mutuality. That is why we say many times that the bar and the bench are two sides of the same coin. Why? They're absolutely different in their roles. But when it comes to public spaces and some things like that, they all must be on the same page.
Just recently also we've seen that anything that happens, the social media is the first to question the independence of the judiciary. There was a recent meeting between the Prime Minister and the Chief Justice during Ganesh Chaturthi, and the first thing brought into question was the independence of the judiciary. Do you honestly think that there is a threat to the independence of the judiciary? One. And two, how broad do the lines between the judiciary and the executive have to be in a country which is based on separation of powers?
Okay. So the first question would be, is the judiciary independent? Speaking for myself and what I have been, and I've been part of this judiciary for 18 years, it is independent. Undoubtedly, it is independent. It knows how to protect its territory and domain. Lines are rarely crossed. The fact that you're flagging one issue over so many years goes to show that it doesn't happen that often. And the idea is that to protect that space is like steel wool between two partitions, right? Insulated only to the point of a bridge when it comes to the judiciary interacting with the executive with the idea of creating more courts, creating more infrastructure. Those requirements of human resources, of getting land, all of that requires building on the institution. Then that bridge must work and shall constantly work. In not just the Chief Justice of India, he has a much higher duty to discharge as a head of the judiciary across the country. Every Chief Justice of a state high court has to keep that channel open to be able to deal with the Chief Justice, his or her team of the top 2 judges and a committee, vis-a-vis maybe the Chief Minister and the Chief Secretary of that state, or the Finance and the Revenue Secretary. If that wouldn't have happened, then how would the judiciary function? After all, we need land. We are not going to go and buy land. That land is going to be procured by the government and given to us. We need building. We need the CPWD, the PWD, and so many agencies to work around us. Why? To be able to make more courts, to be able to dispense justice. Ultimately, who's the consumer of justice? The litigant. It's all being done for them. But when it comes to the distance between a judge and a person from the legislative wing or the executive, that, as I said, that partition, that interplay, that friction with the steel wool in between is important, must be maintained, because what is to be seen by the public is as important as what the judge intends to be seen.
Right.
They are going by public perception. Those perceptions should not be given an opportunity to be diluted by any kind of impression. Our endeavor has always been, at least I can say for myself, has always been in that direction.
There is a debate which is always going on, mostly asked for the
Yeah.
retired judges, the cooling off period, post-retirement jobs.
Yeah.
Should there be a cooling off period at all?
So the post-retirement, I would call them assignments, don't happen all that often. You will notice that, in fact, these days, the trend has changed to a large extent, and judges are doing so well on demitting office and laying down office and being approached by their options of mediation, their options of arbitration. There are always that opinions that are sought from experts, legal experts like judges. So those are much more lucrative, if you would say that, as on post-retirement than maybe a post-retirement assignment. But some people are cut out differently. There are others who may not be interested in doing all that, because frankly, by the time you reach the top court, you've done a couple of decades of hard work. It really is a toll on you, your health, your family life, and everything that surrounds you. And as I said, I'm not complaining, but it is a statement of fact. It does take a toll, whichever way, physically, mentally, time-wise, every way. So when you step out, you want a breather. You want a breather and then perhaps go back to another, take on another role. So it's also the mind of a particular judge in which way they go. Many times they don't want to. Many judges just go back to their states.
But if a judge after retirement takes on a role that has been offered by the government, or a role that's political in any way, do you think that is enough to cast aspersions on what his role during his judgeship has been, or raise questions on his role?
I think there should be a separation on two, because when they are when a judge is wearing the mantle of or sitting in a court as a judge, the whole view is different. After all, we have to live within the four corners of law and deliver judgments on the basis of facts of a case. You can't taint a judge completely merely because somebody has decided at a later stage in life to take what you call a political assignment. The whole career can't be washed away with that one sweeping statement.
Ma'am, what are your retirement plans?
Well, as I said, there is no retirement for me. I had said that I am only retiring, and I stand by that. And re-attiring means, well, you can see more colors on me. Otherwise, perhaps you'd have been seeing me in blacks and whites or grays. I have been able to, I think, happily negotiate the space. And at this moment, have got into arbitrations. I'm a trained mediator. I have got matters referred for mediation. It is a satisfying experience. You're doing something in the same line in which you have been, and happily so.
Talking about a few constitutional issues, because you've dealt with the constitution to a very large extent. When you see issues like the anti-defection law or the 10th schedule, the Supreme Court has time and again said that there is a need to revamp it. But despite that, we are not seeing any movement from the legislature. How pressing do you think these constitutional issues are?
They are pressing because they are playing out in many states with some frequency. But then this question perhaps should be directed towards the legislative wing of the country, because they have to prioritize it. If they don't want any kind of horse trading to happen in any stage, then this is the best way forward.
And also, we are seeing recently that a proposal is going to come through regarding that there should be simultaneous elections throughout the country. Now, federalism is a very important part of the constitution. It's Article 1 says that India is a union of states. Do you think having simultaneous elections will be an attack on federalism, or do you think that both can coexist together?
This would have to be panned out depending on how it plays out. Would it be too early? It's a very tough call, of course, to have a one nation, one vote looking at the volumes. It's a very stupendous task undertaken. At a smallest level, one vote is still being panned out. And in city-states like Delhi and others, where they're still struggling on whether all the courts should collectively have the bar associations should have their election, or they should separate it. This is humongous. It is, from the manpower point of view, from the infrastructure point of view, is a big challenge. And how much is the legislature able to overcome that challenge? They are the ones at whose door the gauntlet is, because they have accepted it as a challenge. Let's see how it works, I would say.
Another thing that we've seen, another major issue in the cases that we've seen in the Supreme Court have been liberty cases, where people's liberty is concerned, especially in politically sensitive cases, where there are also allegations of misuse of draconian laws like the UAPA or the PMLA. Now, the validity of PMLA, certain provisions rather, is itself in question before the Supreme Court. But do you think that this misuse is rampant and that the Supreme Court's need to step in, especially when it comes to draconian laws like this, where liberty is more tough to achieve for an individual?
I think we should not leave it everything to the Supreme Court. Let us not forget that all state high courts are constitutional courts.
Sorry to interrupt you. Why are lower courts and high courts more resistant in granting bail?
And everything has to come to Supreme Court.
Why is it?
You see, in the lower courts, perhaps, and we have said it from different platforms on different occasions, starting from the top, the Chief Justice of India, down the line, many of us have said that don't be scared. You don't have to feel the pressure. Do what you think is right, and let the aggrieved party, whether it is the state or the private litigant, go up to the upper court. Because what is happening, the higher they go, the more the pressure on the courts. The backlog is like killing. And then we are talking of life and liberty, where every day counts, where we can't afford to keep these matters on the back burner. We shouldn't, ideally. One has to take a call, one has to do it quickly. Maybe the propensity to write longer judgment should be curtailed in these kind of jurisdictions also. Because the more you go deeper into it, this is a prima facie case. It has to be made out within the four corners of that. And if it's a law which is stricter, like you said, PMLA or UAP, then keeping in mind those parameters, but not take it to the point of days and days of hearing. That doesn't help anybody. It just delays the process. Again, the matters that catch the attention of the society are those which are high profile. There are ordinary matters also of ordinary persons who are facing these same kind of draconian laws. And they are many times more fast-tracked because they just go through the system. The more the focus on these matters, the more the tendency to have expansive arguments with the top-notch lawyers and all of it. So that itself has its nuances. It delays the process. So it surely matters shouldn't come to the Supreme
Another
Court.
practice which is coming for light is that people who can afford
Yes.
the services of big lawyers, they jump the jurisdiction and come to the top court directly. Do you think that Supreme Court should curb down this kind
Speaking
of practice?
for myself, and I would not say that as a general rule, I think it is very important to have the benefit of one court's view before it comes up to the Supreme Court. You know how the judge in the High Court or the district courts, the state level, has dealt with it, and then apply your mind. Coming straight to the Supreme Court should be avoided. It should be, that forum should be lesser used as the first court.
Right. Ma'am, your message to the lawyers, young lawyers who are yet to
Yeah.
come, studying now, what do you say to them?
Studying now, I think these youngsters are doing really working hard. I wish they would, they have these moot courts. When we had we were studying, we were students, we didn't have that frequency of moot courts. Now we have moot courts of arbitration, we have specialist moot courts, we have mediation moot courts. Everything is being given in big numbers to them. They have the windows. But then that gets a bit too bookish. They don't realize there is a real court outside, and a moot court doesn't mean 30 minutes to this side and 30 minutes to that side with another 10 minutes for a rejoinder. It doesn't work in any court. So they come with that impression many times, and I don't blame them because that's how they panned it out for them, that they'll be heard for that long by any court. Forget about the Supreme Court or the High Court. Even the district court wouldn't have that kind of a time with hundreds of matters listed every day. So a real-time check and a reality check is very important for these youngsters. And that is why I think it's creditable that these universities are now ensuring they do these interns. And they go to court, work with lawyers, real-time, work in law firms, attach themselves to judges to see how courts really function. How on ground is a court working? Till they get into that mode, it's very difficult. Again, youngsters also have the propensity these days in the final year to go join various coaching centers to become judges for taking the exams of the judiciary. The unfortunate part of that is they don't go into practice at all. They are too busy with their coaching and all of that. When they come for interviews after clearing the first two levels of whatever to us, and we are part of the interviewing committee, we find many times on asking them, where do you think does the plaintiff's counsel stand? And they don't know. They don't know that this is where a plaintiff will stand and this is where a defendant's counsel will stand. Or what does a court look like from within? Because they have just been focusing on the bookish academic part. These are things youngsters must focus on. Go to the court, just sit in a court, absorb the atmosphere, the environment, see how lawyers function, see how judges deal with matters. That's a learning experience.
What role do you think both the bench and the bar can play in encouraging more women lawyers, especially who are in litigation, to
Yes.
ensure that we create a larger pool of women lawyers for the judiciary to
So first role would be of the lawyers, because they must give more opportunities to their young colleagues to be able to argue matters. Maybe a smaller application, maybe a simple application, as in bringing a legal heir of a deceased party on record, as in going in for publication because the opposite side can't be served in ordinary course. Those are small things. But the confidence that is built can only be built by doing small things and going up the ladder. So if they would give those opportunities to women, I'm saying men also when they are youngsters, but when I'm talking of women, because they come with a bigger disability vis-a-vis men, that they would gain that confidence that they have, that the senior feels that they are good enough. One, getting them a placement is important. A placement will give them that window. Two, when you are in a court as a judge, I tried always to encourage them with the idea that they should overcome that hesitation, that great latent fear. It's easy to say, to argue a matter. I know of the best of counsels who would say that our mouth dries out when you're addressing the court, or the other side is overwhelming because they are so, the other sides come with a senior who's so important, so well prepared that, they don't know how to take it further. We've all been through the process. I mean, when I'm saying the mouth dries out, sure it does. As a youngster, one would stammer in court because, even if you've learnt everything, when you see the judge, you blank out. It happens. These are real things that happen. So when they go through the experience, they come back richer. And those experiences, judges also must encourage them to Many times a counsel comes running into the court, I would be the first one to say, okay, stop. Take a deep breath, sit down. You're breathless. You can't just pout the matter because the matter's going on. Let the other side cover you for a little while and go back. So the judge also must realize all that. It's not just the lawyer.
Just one last question.
Yeah.
What would your advice be? Because the interest in what is happening in courts is steadily rising, and so is the role of the media who's reporting on these court matters. So what would your advice be to the media who's doing court reporting?
Just give a well-rounded report, be in balance. One stray statement here or there sometimes can really be misleading. And the public has that great faith because they're not there. They're relying on what the media is saying. So if you would give on any contentious issue, a balanced report, probably that would go down better for both sides.
Thank you, Justice Seema
Thank
Kohli.
you.
You did not skirt around any questions. Took all the questions head on, and we appreciate
That's
deeply.
so kind of you.
so
Thank you for coming.
much. Thank you.
Thank you so much.